On the night of December 14th, 2025, something happened that immediately drew the attention of military analysts, diplomats, and intelligence services far beyond Ukraine. According to early reports, Ukrainian forces carried out a long-range precision strike against a high-value Russian military facility located well behind the front lines. The details remain incomplete. Independent confirmation is still developing. But even with limited verified information, one thing is already clear. This was not a routine exchange in an ongoing war. What made this moment unusual was not the existence of a strike. Ukraine has conducted long-range operations before. What made it different was where the strike appears to have landed, how deeply it penetrated, and what assumptions it quietly challenged. For months, an unspoken understanding had existed that certain logistical and command nodes, especially those far from the battlefield, were relatively insulated, not immune but protected by distance, air defense layers, and political risk calculations. If the reports from the night of December 14th are accurate, that assumption no longer holds. And this is where the political meaning begins. Because in modern war, the most consequential actions are not always those that change the map. They are the ones that change expectations about safety, about control, and about escalation. This strike, if confirmed, forces a question that neither Moscow nor Kiev can avoid, and that allied capitals are already debating quietly. If distance no longer guarantees protection, how does deterrence function at all? Based on available reporting from Ukrainian and regional sources, the event in question occurred late on December 14th, 2025. Ukrainian forces are believed to have used long-range unmanned systems or precision-guided weapons to strike a Russian military facility involved in logistics, coordination, or command support. The reported location lies significantly behind active combat zones, possibly within Crimea or southern Russian territory. Russian authorities acknowledged an incident but provided limited details, emphasizing air defense activity and minimizing damage, a response pattern seen previously. What remains unconfirmed are the exact nature of the target, the scale of disruption, and the full operational method used. And that uncertainty matters, because the importance of this event does not hinge on visible destruction, it hinges on demonstrated reach. If Ukraine was able to identify, plan, and execute a strike against a protected node at that depth, it suggests a level of intelligence penetration, coordination, and operational confidence that goes beyond tactical messaging. Symbolically, this is significant. These facilities represent continuity, the ability to sustain war over time. They are not frontline units. They are the machinery that keeps everything else functioning. Striking such a target sends a different signal than striking troops or equipment near the battlefield. It communicates vulnerability not just to weapons, but to planning assumptions. The reason this strike matters politically is not because of what was hit, but because of what it was assumed could not be hit easily. Logistical and command infrastructure located far from the front is the backbone of sustained warfare. It is where planning becomes execution, where resources become pressure, where wars are made survivable for those fighting them. For Russia, these nodes are designed to be stable. They exist specifically to avoid disruption. They are defended not only militarily but conceptually, protected by the belief that attacking them carries escalation risks. If that belief is eroding, the consequences ripple outward. This is why such targets are often described, informally, as untouchable. Not because they are impossible to strike, but because striking them forces political decisions that leaders prefer to postpone. For Ukraine, demonstrating the ability to reach this far reshapes its negotiating position. It suggests that time does not exclusively favor the larger power. It signals that adaptation is ongoing. For Russia, the challenge is internal as much as external. If rear area facilities require the same level of protection as frontline positions, the entire security calculus shifts. And for Ukraine's allies, the implications are delicate. Successes of this kind raise support arguments but also escalation concerns. The same action that demonstrates capability also narrows diplomatic margins. This is why such nights are never simply good or bad. They are clarifying. If the reported strike on the night of December 14th is confirmed in its essential elements, the immediate question is not simply what was hit, but how such an operation was possible at all. Operations of this depth are not improvised. They require a convergence of capabilities that go well beyond a single weapon system. According to military analysts, four elements are typically necessary: intelligence access, targeting confidence, delivery reach, and an understanding of defensive gaps. First, intelligence. Identifying a high-value rear area facility requires more than satellite imagery. Static images alone are insufficient. Planners must understand function, activity patterns, and timing. That suggests sustained surveillance, potentially combining open-source intelligence, electronic signals, pattern-of-life analysis, and information provided through partners or indirect channels. None of these elements alone is decisive, but together they create a targeting picture that can be acted upon with confidence. Second, targeting confidence. Striking deep behind the front lines carries political and military risk. Mistakes are costly. The decision to proceed implies a belief that the target was correctly identified and that the expected effect justified the escalation risk. That confidence does not necessarily mean certainty, but it does suggest that Ukrainian planners assess the probability of success as politically acceptable. Third, delivery reach. Ukraine's ability to conduct long-range operations has evolved over time. Domestic drone development, adapted unmanned systems, and precision-guided capabilities have gradually extended operational reach. These systems are often less about raw destructive power and more about penetration and persistence. The ability to reach a target that does not expect to be threatened. Importantly, this does not require overwhelming force. It requires enough capability to exploit a moment. Which brings us to the fourth element: defensive gaps. No air defense network, regardless of sophistication, can provide uniform protection across vast territory at all times. Defense systems are built on prioritization, protecting critical assets while accepting risk elsewhere. When threat expectations are focused on one axis, another becomes more vulnerable. If this strike occurred as reported, it may indicate that Ukrainian planners identified such a gap, whether temporal, geographic, or procedural. That does not imply systemic failure on the Russian side. It implies strain. Strain accumulates over long wars. Systems are redeployed, operators rotate, alert levels fluctuate. Over time, predictability erodes. There is also the human factor. Rear area facilities often operate under a different security psychology than frontline units. Even when formally protected, they may not function as if they are under constant threat. That gap between doctrine and expectation is difficult to close completely. Taken together, these elements suggest that the December 14th event was less about a single breakthrough and more about adaptive pressure. Ukraine appears to be probing, learning, and exploiting opportunities as they emerge. Russia, meanwhile, is forced to defend an increasingly broad set of assumptions. This does not mean escalation is inevitable, but it does mean the margin for error is narrowing. When capability improves incrementally and gaps appear intermittently, conflict dynamics become harder to stabilize. Each side is compelled to plan not only for what is happening now, but for what might suddenly become possible next. And that uncertainty, more than any individual strike, is what reshapes strategic calculations. The most immediate effects of a strike like the one reported on December 14th are not found on the battlefield. They emerge quietly, behind closed doors, in political systems forced to reassess risk, responsibility, and control. In Moscow, public messaging following such incidents is typically restrained and deliberate. Official statements emphasize continuity, resilience, and defensive success. That outward calm, however, should not be mistaken for internal indifference. According to analysts familiar with Russian decision-making patterns, rear area strikes tend to trigger intense internal reviews, not only of air defense coverage, but of command assumptions and information flows. The political challenge for Russian leadership is layered. On one level, there is the need to reassure the public that the state remains in control. On another, there is pressure from within the security establishment to explain how a protected facility could be threatened at all. These reviews are not merely technical. They are about accountability, who anticipated what and who did not. At the same time, escalation choices become more constrained. Retaliation is not simply a military question. It is a political calculation shaped by international reaction, economic pressure, and domestic tolerance for prolonged risk. Each response option carries trade-offs, and none are cost-free. In Kiev, the political shockwaves take a different form. If the operation is viewed internally as a success, it reinforces confidence in Ukraine's adaptive capacity. But it also places additional weight on leadership decisions. Demonstrating reach creates expectations among the public, among the military, and among international partners. Managing those expectations becomes as important as managing the battlefield. Ukrainian leadership must balance signaling strength with preserving support. Actions that appear effective can simultaneously reassure allies and unsettle them. The same strike that demonstrates capability may raise concerns about escalation thresholds and long-term sustainability. This balancing act is particularly delicate because Ukraine's political survival remains deeply intertwined with external backing. Each high-profile operation invites scrutiny, not just of effectiveness but of intent. Among allied governments, the reactions are cautious and complex. Privately, such events are studied closely. Defense ministries assess what the strike reveals about capability development and intelligence integration. Foreign ministries consider diplomatic implications. Political leaders weigh domestic perceptions, especially in societies where support for Ukraine competes with economic pressure and war fatigue. Public responses tend to remain measured, emphasizing Ukraine's right to self-defense while avoiding language that could be interpreted as endorsing escalation. That careful phrasing reflects an underlying tension. Allies want Ukraine to succeed, but they also want the conflict to remain bounded. This tension has no easy resolution. What makes the political shockwaves of December 14th particularly significant is their cumulative nature. No single strike transforms policy, but each one adds pressure to existing debates about risk tolerance, burden sharing, and end-state assumptions. Over time, these quiet reactions shape the strategic environment more than any headline. They influence budget decisions, arms transfers, diplomatic posture, and red line definitions, often incrementally and often without public acknowledgement. In that sense, the real impact of such a night unfolds slowly. Not in dramatic declarations, but in subtle shifts of confidence, caution, and calculation, shifts that determine how long a war can be sustained, and under what conditions it might eventually change course. The strategic consequences of the reported December 14th strike do not hinge on immediate battlefield outcomes. They unfold over time, reshaping planning assumptions, resource allocation, and political risk calculations on all sides. The first and most immediate change is psychological. If rear area military infrastructure can no longer be assumed relatively secure, strategic depth loses some of its meaning. For Russia, this does not mean that the balance of power has suddenly shifted. It does mean that confidence in insulation, the belief that distance alone reduces vulnerability, becomes harder to sustain. That shift forces adaptation. Resources that might otherwise support frontline operations may need to be diverted to internal protection. Air defense systems, surveillance assets, and personnel are finite. Expanding coverage inevitably creates trade-offs. Every additional asset assigned to rear defense is one not used elsewhere. Over time, this redistribution affects tempo, flexibility, and endurance. For Ukraine, the strategic impact is more subtle but no less significant. Demonstrating long-range reach strengthens deterrence by complicating Russian planning. It suggests that Ukraine is not confined to reactive defense but can impose costs unpredictably. However, this also imposes discipline. Capabilities that raise strategic pressure must be used selectively. Overuse risks diminishing returns and increasing escalation pressure without proportional gain. This creates a paradox. Success expands options, but it also narrows margins for error. For Ukraine's allies, December 14th reinforces an already difficult strategic debate: how to sustain support while managing escalation risk over an open-ended timeline. Each demonstration of Ukrainian capability strengthens arguments for continued assistance. At the same time, it intensifies concerns about control, signaling, and end-state clarity. Allied planning increasingly reflects this duality. Military aid decisions are paired with diplomatic messaging. Capability enhancement is accompanied by caution about intent. The objective is not simply battlefield advantage, but controlled pressure. Pressure that degrades adversary capacity without triggering uncontrollable response. Another long-term consequence lies in normalization. As strikes of this kind occur, and even intermittently, they become part of the strategic environment rather than exceptional events. Once normalized, they alter baseline expectations. Defense planners adapt. Political leaders adjust rhetoric. What once seemed escalatory becomes routine, and the threshold for concern shifts upward. This dynamic cuts both ways. Normalization can stabilize behavior by clarifying boundaries, but it can also desensitize decision makers to risk, especially when short-term consequences appear manageable. There is also a broader systemic effect. December 14th fits into a pattern in which modern conflicts increasingly blur front lines and rear areas. Precision, intelligence integration, and unmanned systems compress space. Geography offers less protection than it once did. Strategic depth becomes conditional, not absolute. This trend extends beyond Ukraine. Militaries worldwide are watching closely, drawing lessons about vulnerability, resilience, and adaptation. The implications reach into defense doctrine, infrastructure planning, and alliance coordination well beyond the current war. Crucially, none of these consequences imply imminent resolution. Wars rarely end because one assumption fails. They evolve as multiple assumptions erode simultaneously. December 14th represents one such erosion, meaningful but not decisive. The strategic environment after that night is not transformed, but it is subtly altered. Planning becomes more cautious. Expectations become more conditional. Risk calculations become more complex. And in long conflicts, complexity itself is a strategic force. It slows decision-making, increases friction, and raises the cost of error. Whether that ultimately favors restraint or escalation remains uncertain. But what is clear is that after December 14th, the war is being planned, and on all sides, with a slightly different understanding of what is possible. And in strategy, even small shifts in possibility can have lasting effects. When analysts look back on the night of December 14th, 2025, they are unlikely to describe it as a turning point in the conventional sense. Territory did not suddenly change hands. The war did not end. Power did not decisively shift. And yet, this night will almost certainly be studied, because its importance lies not in what was destroyed, but in what was reconsidered. If the reported strike is broadly confirmed, it marked a moment when assumptions quietly weakened. Assumptions about distance, protection, and the predictability of escalation. Those assumptions had helped structure decision-making on all sides. Once questioned, they cannot easily be restored. For Ukraine, December 14th reinforced a narrative of adaptation and persistence. It demonstrated that constraints are not static and that capability can evolve even under pressure. But it also underscored the burden that comes with reach, the responsibility to wield it carefully, strategically, and with awareness of long-term consequences. For Russia, the night introduced additional uncertainty into planning that already operates under strain. It suggested that the line between front and rear is less stable than before, and that security is increasingly a matter of probability rather than guarantee. And for the wider international community, December 14th served as another reminder that this war is not frozen. It is dynamic, iterative, and capable of producing moments that reshape expectations without announcing themselves loudly. History often focuses on dramatic breakthroughs, but prolonged conflicts are more often shaped by quieter inflection points. Moments when leaders adjust their calculations, when planners revise their assumptions, when risk is understood differently than the day before. December 14th appears to be one of those moments. Not because it ended anything, but because it subtly changed how the war is imagined, planned, and feared. And in geopolitics, imagination and fear are forces as real as any weapon.